official record. So if you put something in the chat or choose to utilize the chat on Teams, please also state your comments aloud for the record, for the formal record of the meeting. And then with the customary land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and the land. I'd like to acknowledge that we live and work on the unceded land of the Dena'ina people and thank them for their past, present, future stewardship of the land on which we live. And move on to a roll call vote.
Mr. Matthew Harvey.
Present.
Mr. Al Tamani.
Here.
Mr. Brian Flynn.
Present.
Mr. Nolan Cloudus said he would be in later. Mr. Robert Helser.
Present.
Ms. Lindsay Hobson. Mr. Mark Lucan.
Here.
Ms. Carla McConnell.
Present.
Mr. Jared Riedel. And Ms. Carmela Wardhill.
And then moving on to approval of agenda.
I move to approve.
I'll make a slight change to the agenda real quick, if I may. Item 6B, GASB citations. It's my understanding OMB requested that we might replace that with a short discussion of the annual comprehensive report. Is that correct?
Status update.
And so approval of the agenda as amended.
I shall move.
Second. And without objection, the agenda is approved. And moving on to informational reports. So for the chair's report, just very briefly, the Anchorage School District, under discussion with OMB and the Anchorage School District members, we excuse them from this meeting and the next meeting because the school board isn't meeting during the summer and there's not a lot of budget actions happening during the summer. But I wanted to ask everybody on the commission if that was okay with everybody or if we'd like to hear from them next meeting.
I think they ought to be reporting to us, yeah.
Any other? After this meeting, I can reach out to them. I think really the main things that they're working on right now are there's a right sizing survey that they put out. They don't really have results on that yet. And then with the academies program that got approved at the last school board meeting, I know the administration will be working on that, but not a lot of school board actions until August. But I can talk to them about that, and I'll probably send some email correspondence out to the commission.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to hear from them about, they call it right sizing, consolidation, whatever we want to call it. I'd love to hear what the plan is.
It seems to me when Andy was reporting, they reported every meeting. I don't recall them taking the summers off. Not that that's a bad thing, but
Speaking of the school board, why it'd be interesting to see how much income they had budgeted from the city and how much they're going to get with the tax increases we've had. Probably see a difference there.
And that was kind of my next thing is we have a number of topics, tax increases, a sales tax proposal, things like that. I'll probably send some emails out to the commission just about possible future topics and ask that others send in anything that might be of interest for the next 4 or 5 months, maybe 6 months, really plan out ahead, try to get some forward-looking meeting.
Bring that up in the discussion.
Yeah, I think we talked about it a little bit more during the discussions. I know that's going to be a big one. It might have obviously tax implications, but then depending on where the commission wants to go, there might be tax cap implications or things with the tax cap looking only at property taxes and adding new tax, depending on how the commission wants to approach all those things.
Well, I think Mark and I were I know we're talking about the gas tax. And when we set that up and recommended to the assembly years ago that that be put into a separate account. But it never was. And I think there's about 14 or $15 million we get. And I think we may want to talk to them about maybe setting that up in a trust account. I set the city monies up in a trust account and specified membership. And that way, why we need a lot of asphalt in this town and it's not really getting there.
Yeah, so I'll send out some emails to the commission as a whole. And if we just do reply alls and try to, and I can consolidate all the input that we get, requests we get about possible future subjects. If we get them in ahead of time, then we might be able to combine things as well and have a dual focus meetings or things like that. And I think lastly, we have 3 members, 3 seats that are expiring at the end of this month. And so if I'd just check on the expiration dates of membership on the commission and either renew or if you could let us know, we'll look for contact with the administration and try to fill up the commission again so we don't have any quorum issues, especially with all the topics, sales tax and things coming down. Issue recommendations. I think that's the chair's report. Could move on. We have Assembly Member Brawley here.
Yeah.
For the Assembly report.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Anna Brawley. And I'm going to be, I'm going to need to leave after I give my report, but I have a few things to share. And then also, sorry, I walked in right in the middle, but just for my prior experience on this board, I would recommend members not replying all because you guys are also subject to the Open Meetings Act. And so what you should do is send everything through staff and they can compile it and send it back out. Just, I mean, obviously, not a huge deal, but because we went through that, like, can we take votes by email, you know, all those things. So, and I've heard from other boards, so just recommendation. And then, yeah, as far as members, you know, there's the new administration incoming. So I would, if your term is expiring, I would just encourage reaching out to right now the transition team. But because we have one more meeting before July 1st when the new mayor gets sworn in, but I don't know how much is going to be on that agenda, right? So anyway, and then you're welcome to contact members of the assembly as well, but we obviously confirm the folks that we have that are brought forward. So it's really that's a mayor's office function. Okay, so then to my report, let's see, I know Meg was here last month. I guess I want to address more things that are happening, I guess, outside of the assembly, but just so you're aware and around budget issues. Let's see. Let me make a quick note. Well, one is, I guess, coming up, 2 items that are maybe relevant to you guys that are of interest, alcohol tax and marijuana tax. So the voters last year approved dedicating marijuana tax funding. So now it is like alcohol tax. So it has, it's intended for early education and childcare. So it's not the same set of intended uses. There is overlap, of course, in terms of preventing child abuse and all these other pieces around prevention, early education. So where we are with both of those, on the marijuana tax side, tomorrow, actually, there is a work session on creating what's called the accountability board. That was part of the ballot proposition. So that will be a new advisory board. And then it will get seated hopefully this summer. Of course, you know, appointments are going to come back to the assembly for confirmation at some point. But the intent really of that accountability board is its primary function is to make recommendations to the mayor and the assembly for use of those funds within the confines of what they can be used for. And so the board is intended to have a diverse composition of, you know, potentially parents, providers, experts in the field, right? You know, and we're working through that ordinance. So tomorrow there is a work session to discuss that with the intent of taking a vote. It's already on the agenda for the 25th. So getting that board in place, you know, whatever it ends up looking like. And then of course, it'll be up to the mayor's office to get it seated. And then they will, I've been part of an implementation team made up of a couple assembly members, a school board member, folks from organizations like Alaska Children's Trust, THREAD, a couple of the original advocates who worked on that ballot proposition, and several providers and parents. So really our group is meeting to make some initial recommendations, looking at what best practices would be, what the state of the field is, what other folks are doing, like the governor's task force on childcare. And then the intent of the implementation team is really to shepherd that forward and then hand that work to the board to make decisions. So not to do the work of the board, but knowing that they're going to have a tough job coming in later this summer or early fall, and all of a sudden they're going to have to make budget recommendations. And then I will also note that because that new dedicated tax took effect in 2024, there is already money being collected and it's sitting in a fund. There's not been a decision of what to do about it yet, but the board is going to potentially look at what maybe one-time uses for that 2024 funding, and then going forward year over year, we'll get about 5 million is the estimate for a marijuana tax. So anyway, so that's something to just kind of be aware of. And of course, this body can also consider recommendations for that. There's a lot of materials that will be, I think some are available already, but that will move forward as far as recommendations. So that's just something for your radar that you guys could take a look and recommend. And then on alcohol tax, that one obviously is already a dedicated tax. It's in effect, it's in the budget. But we have been doing a strategic planning exercise. So again, with some assembly members and community members, I don't think we have school board, but we have Anchorage Health Department. So, and that one is more looking, this tax has been in effect for a few years. It's gone to various uses. So it's really forward thinking, what is the strategic use of those funds? And of course, not making immediate changes to what's being funded now, but kind of over time, what would the recommendation be? Are there ways to turn over uses of those funds so that we're not funding the same thing for 20 years, right? That kind of conversation. And then actually later today, we're going to have a conversation with the assembly around kind of some broad goals that have been put forward and how we want to maybe utilize those in the 2025 budget. So that's also just something to be aware of. It doesn't mean that there'll be big changes to where alcohol tax funding goes. And there is no separate board like there is with marijuana tax, but really just looking at that. And also looking more on the administration side, there's been a lot of issues with grants not going out in time, or also kind of more processing issues that are not within the purview of the assembly, but were identified as things that we need to improve, because this is supposed to be a strategic plan overall, not just for the assembly and not just for budgeting, but really helping smaller organizations access that funding, making sure that we are diversifying where the funding goes, those kinds of big issues, and then when those decisions are made, how it gets out into the community and how people can access that and apply for it. So anyway, so those are kind of two tax conversations. And then the third one, and this is where I said it's outside of the purview of the assembly right now, although there's already been confusion about that, is you probably saw earlier this week, AEDC, Anchorage Economic Development Corporation, and many business leaders in the community have brought forward a proposal for sales tax. And they have been working with a couple, or I think 3 assembly members. I'm not one of them. Randy Solt, Felix Rivera, and Scott Myers have been kind of part of those conversations with the idea that they would help bring it to the rest of the assembly for discussion. But just to be clear, that work at this point has been separate. So I've been briefed on it, for example. I don't know who else has, but it is really the business group who is bringing basically a very similar proposal to what the city of Oklahoma City did years ago, which is add on to their existing sales tax. So I think you guys should definitely be engaged in that conversation. Would love to hear thoughts about kind of what their proposal looks like, or recommendations there. They're soliciting public feedback right now. They've been doing polling, I understand, and they have, I think, a survey out asking what kinds of projects you would want to see funded through this revenue. So I'll just note from a budget perspective, and I have shared this back with Jenna Wright from AEDC. Other than that, have not really been involved yet, but wanted to flag some things for them. So I just want to put on your radar, because I think that I have some concerns about. Well, I'll back up. So I think there is a valid conversation to have about sales tax, right? We're a city that doesn't have one. It is something a lot of cities have, including in Alaska. We know that we have challenges paying for, keeping up with cost increases as far as staff salaries, right? So there's a lot of conversation we can have. The challenges that I see with this proposal, one is we need to have a conversation about the idea of granting 2/3 of it basically as property tax relief. So what they are proposing is that it goes under the cap. It's a 1-for-1 swap for revenue. So in terms of having bigger discussions about how we fund government, what level of service people expect, whether we need to, for example, pay more for snow plowing long-term, all of those things are precluded by the idea that you're just fitting it under the cap. So I think that's a conversation, is how much of it should be property tax relief. And I want to be clear, I'm not opposed to the idea of property tax relief. I am right now opposed to the idea that all of that would simply be a 1-for-1 swap of current funding, because I don't think that actually solves the problems that we have in the community. And I don't think that the ADC folks have contemplated the implications of that. It also gives a fair amount of relief to property owners. So the question is, does that trickle down to renters? And as we know, even if your landlord gets a break on their taxes, they may or may not pass that on in rent costs. So I think that's another conversation to have, is how does that relief, or how does that additional benefit distribute across the community? Another one that I have some heartburn with is not the idea of building capital projects. And again, these are all my personal views. Not whether we should build capital projects, but my questions are, how does this fit into the capital improvement program, right? That's the way that we have a 6-year process for deciding what things we fund and why. And also the proposal right now is to essentially pay cash for all of those things. So the way Oklahoma City did it, because they don't have bonding, and I learned this from a presentation from a former Oklahoma City mayor, they don't have a bonding mechanism. The voters don't approve capital projects through bond financing. And so that was their workaround, was to say, okay, we'll collect money, we'll put it in a fund, and then when we have the cash, we will pay cash for capital projects. And so it took them several years to build up enough money to do these projects, but they have been able to do several rounds of them. The downside of that, and especially in this environment, is we know interest rates are high. They can go up and down, obviously. Costs escalate year over year, and that the rate of escalation seems to be increasing. And so the question is, if you wait to pay cash for something, are you ever going to be able to build it? Or is the cost of that thing going to keep ballooning 3 years, as you're waiting to collect enough revenue? So can you collect enough revenue at a rate fast enough that you're going to be able to pay for the project that you've originally scoped out 5 years ago? And of course, we do bond in this community. And so that's a question I have about that particular proposal, whether that is a smart way to do projects, versus financing something. And then lastly, I'll just note, that again, I think the conversation really needs to be holistic around how we use tax revenue. So I think there's another conversation that's been brought up to this body as well around bed tax, right? So maybe some of the project revenue that we need can also come from changes to the bed tax, which is also a charter change. It's, all of these things are really big structural changes, but I think it's worth having a conversation about how these pieces fit together, as opposed to just making a decision on one of them in a vacuum, right? So anyway, so as I said, that conversation is going to continue. I really encourage you guys to follow it as well. Also reach out to AEDC if you do have questions, or like I said, there are 3 assembly folks working on it. So I can't speak to what their plans are, but I would encourage engagement in that. And then I don't know the time frame for it coming back to the assembly, but I imagine it would be in the fall. And it sounds like their goal is to get it on the ballot for April 2025. So we would need to make a decision on it by late January. So that's kind of just a big piece again that is worth noting. And then I'll share 2 other things within the assembly purview. We are going to start talking about our budget priorities for the coming year, and then with the goal of really working through those at a high level, looking back at our current priorities, do we want to make changes, and then making sure that we are proactively communicating that to the incoming administration, probably in July sometime, as broad assembly priorities. And the goal there is to, because there's been the last few years kind of obviously a more adversarial relationship, but also less collaboration than there has been in the past upfront about kind of broad priorities. Because, if you guys have watched, the administration will put forward a budget, we would bring a substitute budget, right? And a lot of those kind of decisions get crunched at the back end. So our goal is to communicate priorities earlier, talk about those with the administration, and potentially with individual departments as well, and really just kind of work through the budget process earlier. Of course, that all of that recognizing it is the mayor's prerogative to put forward a budget, right? So we're not assuming that all of our priorities would go in that initial budget. And so there's still, I imagine, going to be amendments, but that's really our plan. So also look for that from the assembly. We're going to have a little bit of conversation about that today in the rules committee meeting. And then mostly, I think we're going to have another work session, and then probably in July, we'll pick that up further. So anyway, so lots of good budget conversations to have, and just putting that on the radar. And again, would love to hear your guys' feedback if you'd like to participate in that conversation. I think there's a lot of options there. And then lastly, I will just offer property tax bills have gone out. I know there's a lot of frustration, of course, as people's property taxes go up. So I just want to put two things kind of in your mind, and I shared these with the ADN reporter who wrote the article about property tax as well. One is the biggest driving factor in tax increases, like the dollar amount that you're paying, is home value. The fact that our home values are going up means that you're paying more in taxes because you multiply the rate times your home value. So the rate is actually the mill rates for most people. Can't speak for every service area. The mill rates for most people are actually a little bit lower than last year. And of course, when you adjust for inflation, our budget really has been flat because of the tax cap. The tax cap constrains how much your budget can grow or shrink. That plus whatever we pass in bonds or don't pass, and then the bond debt that gets retired. So that's really important to understand. So, oh, sorry. Does Carl have a question? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was gonna let you finish the call and call.
Okay.
Or Carla, sorry.
Yeah, yeah, and then just briefly, so that's one thing to understand is that it's the value of your home or the value of your property times the mill rate. So both of those things are factors, and then of course how much we collect in taxes. The other thing just to note is big picture. We are not building enough housing, and more generally, we are not changing the physical. Mostly, we are not changing the physical look and feel of the city through new development. So we do see some things downtown. We are seeing some housing getting built, mostly high-end housing, right? There are some things happening, but it's very much at a scatter shot and much lower level than we've seen in the past. I'd say there was a huge drop off since the 2000s, for example. Some of that is because we filled out the physical footprint of our city. Some of that is cost increase. There's other factors, but really the consequence of that is that our tax base is not growing. And it's actually, if you adjust for inflation, shrinking in value. So that could be a combination of more people using exemptions or smaller or bigger exemptions. But also it is just the reality that our properties are aging and deteriorating, right? So, and then they are still increasing in value because we're not adding enough new development to the city. And so that really, as a planner and as a budget person, that is a fundamental threat to the viability of the city long term. If we cannot pay for the infrastructure we already have, if we are losing residents and we are taxing our existing residents more and more, and not carving up the land into smaller pieces, not making more condos, right? Like we're not diversifying our tax base in terms of residents. And so that's just something to be aware of as well, that is not a good place for a city to be. And that is partly why I personally am so focused on making it easier to build housing, which can also make other developments easier to build depending on what we're changing, like the permitting process. But really, we should all think about this not just as we need more housing, not just as solving homelessness, not just as that kind of big collection of issues, people moving away, but also how do we continue to pay for our city? And those things are absolutely related. And I think a lot of folks don't think about them as related, but I just want to put that on the table and something to chew on. So with that, I know I shared a lot of information as usual. I'm happy to take questions.
That's good, thank you. Member McConnell?
Oh, I think she's on mute, yeah.
Oh, sorry, there I am. Thank you for the report. Sorry about all that.
No, we can hear you now.
Yeah, good. This is just a comment. I just want to encourage the assembly to sit back and think about letting the free market, as you say, take its natural course when you're thinking about what to do with the tax revenue. I mean, even if you're talking about it rolling down to the renters and whether or not the landlords do that, that's going to be hard to regulate, first of all, but the market will take care of that if you allow it to do so. Sometimes when the government dips their fingers in things, it knocks things off kilter. So I just want to encourage that we try to use the tax revenue, wisely and not try to what I want to say, negotiate with every level, if that makes any sense. Just my comments, since you said these were kind of your personal opinions too, but especially on the rental revenue, because those that pass it on to the renters will have more renters. And then that fixes that, right? Everybody's
yeah.
like, shut up. Sorry, I'm an economics major, so those things always fascinate me. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess, thanks for that comment. Just to clarify, so you're talking about the sales tax proposal or the property tax?
The sales tax, the property tax, that's what I meant.
Okay, thanks.
You said you were, there was a concern that owners would not pass the savings onto the renters, right? Or were you worried they'd pass the tax on to the renters? Sorry, I'm doing two things at one time.
Yeah,
Let's
no,
just-
that's, and I think
let's just ignore the comments and move on. I do appreciate the update. Thank you so much.
yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I'll just comment, obviously, when you're talking about changing, well, really any significant policy in the city, but especially tax policy, right? There's just a lot of questions to work through. And so, so I'm looking forward to hearing ADC's proposal and then having that conversation. But at this point, I would certainly say, I wouldn't expect that it's written exactly as it is, that's what's going to go to the ballot. There's lots of steps before that.
I would just thank you for that. There was a lot of great information in there. But I would also add that your final argument is a great argument for the sales tax. In other words, we want to diversify our tax base. There's a great opportunity right there.
I think what you should take a look at on property taxes, instead of 2 payments a year, let people make 3. And that's going to ease the burden on older folks and people that don't have a lot of money. And I think, why not?
Yeah, that's a good point. And that is something, I'd have to research if that's in code or if that's more of a policy, because I know some things are set in code and other things are just how we've done things for a long time. So I think that's a great question. That's a good one to ask the assessor as well.
I think it might be a good idea to let us know what that response is.
Mhm.
And I think another question that needs to be addressed is that the state tax code in reference to municipalities, that they may collect fees in lieu of taxes from nonprofits.
So yeah, this is another question that it probably isn't for right now, but maybe another time. There was some legislation at the state level that passed with regards to property tax and assessment values, things like that. It's probably a question more so for the property tax department from the administration, but in the future, I might ask them to come. Maybe if we have a discussion about property taxes as a whole.
The legislation allows the exemption to increase every year rather than be set at a flat.
Yeah, and if I remember right, it also had some effects on assessment methods. And so I might ask when we have maybe a bigger sales tax, and that I think Jack would probably come for a discussion like that because it has property tax implications, things like that as well. Yeah, Alan.
I think in reviewing that article that was in the paper that they expect to eliminate a lot of taxes. At least the article implied that. And so I think that that's something that the assembly should have that committee take a look at. If a sales tax is passed, what revenue is that going to reduce to the city? And I know a number of taxes out there that will be gone. in millions.
And I guess I'm confused. Do you mean just because there'd be less economic activity or?
Well,
What would
because
it-
of the description that was in the paper
Hmm.
of the items they would eliminate in order to get the sales tax.
Okay, yeah, and like I said, I'm not familiar with all the details, but I mean, one follow-up could be to ask AEDC to come present. I think that would be appropriate.
Yeah, I think we'll probably have a meeting focused on the sales tax proposal. And there's a number of different things, when we look at tag first is like whether or not it's a good idea. And then there's the high level splits as to where it could go. And then maybe there's exemptions in commercial property, non-commercial property, or nonprofits or things like that. And then how the sales tax revenues are going to be, if you collect $5 million sales tax revenue, what are you doing with that in the time that you're waiting for projects to be initiated? So all those conversations, I think we'll probably have a meeting about specifically. And then, yeah, I think that, is there any other questions for some? Well, I appreciate you coming,
Yeah.
as always, and having a comprehensive report.
Yeah, I'll share one more brief thing, and this is again outside the purview of the assembly, but just because I haven't seen it shared yet. There is a transition process going on. Of course, I'm not involved. I know it's between the two administrations. And there's a website, I think it's teamanchorage.com. And it's so, for example, if you want information about incoming Mayor LaFrance's priorities or all these other things, if you are looking for a job and you want to submit, or somebody who would like to work for the administration, and just any other information about the transition, I would encourage folks to go there. And again, not something that I'm involved in, but just I know folks have questions, and I haven't gone through transition before because I haven't been here that long. So anyway, so just wanted to share that as well.
Awesome. Yeah, appreciate it. Teamanchorage.com.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, and have a good rest of your meeting.
And then we'll move to item 6A. Chair.
So I don't have an agenda in front of me. Which one was the first one? Oh, okay. So I'm gonna have to go kind of quickly. The first one was a request to talk about what we talked briefly about last time, which is what are some of the things that are hard to see that represent financial statement risks. So I have a
Hi.
If you could just make sure that you're muted.
Okay, so that represent risks that may not be apparent to all. And so I've got a really brief list here. The first one is a general rule, which is we have a whole bunch of funds, over 100 funds in the municipality, which violates the underlying rule of governmental accounting, which is to have as few funds as possible. And the municipality is probably one of the worst violators of that in the entire United States, but it is what it is. And one of the rules is that if you're dealing with a fund that's outside of the 100 series of funds, that's where trouble can start. Okay, and so all of these problem areas all fall with outside the 100 areas of funds. So let's start with one that we've already talked about, which is workers' comp and general liability. So workers' comp charges premiums for workers' compensation insurance to all of the departments that have employees within the municipality. And theoretically, the premiums should cover all of the costs of that department. But they haven't been successful in charging sufficient premiums for well over a decade. And as a result, they've been growing a bigger and bigger and bigger deficit. And the reason is because the methodology that was established a long time ago was flawed. What happens is one time a year, they set up the premiums, but the premiums are based on the upcoming budget. And the upcoming budget doesn't have a catch-up provision for the year-end what I call surprises, such as the IBNR, when the actuaries say, hey, here's what's going to come in the future, or incurred but not reported claims. Someone has gone to the hospital yesterday, but we don't know about it yet. And the growth in the workers' comp deficit has started to sort of increase exponentially lately. So at the end of 2022, The deficit was 14 million. I estimate at the end of 2023, it'll be about 18 million. And my estimate for 2024 is that it should be about 22 million. So that's what I think the scope of the problem will be. What the solution is, we need to send out a gigantic premium catch-up to all the departments, including municipal light and power, before municipal light and power is closed up. And that has to happen in 2023. So that's the first one. The second one is the Building Safety Fund, which is very special because that one will take at least a decade to be cured. The reason why that one can't be cured quickly is because it's a service area fund. So in other words, the people in Eagle River are not part of this fund. They're not part of that service area. So we can't just cure it by issuing a journal entry where everyone receives a little bit of pain and it's solved. Only the folks in the service area can be part of the solution. So there's 3 ways to cure this problem. Number 1, increase the fees to the developers who submit plans for permits, but that's not a really good solution. Number 2 is reduce the expenses, but then the developers will have to even wait longer for their services, and that's not a good solution. Or the third solution is start a tax for the people living in that service area, which happened this year for the first time. So if you live where I live, which is on Hillside, and you look at your mill rate, all the components of what make up your mill rate, you'll see for the first time in 15 years, you're paying a building service area mill rate. And that's what happened this year. But it's going to take many, many, many years to cure that problem. So that's because that's outside of the 100 areas. Number 3.
Sharon, do we know why that's part of the service area? And it's called building area or building those areas?
It should be called the planning department. So I don't know why it's got the name that it has. It's an unusual name. Or maybe the Anchorage, Bull, Girdwood, and Hillside development. I think the name is very weird. But I don't know the history of it. I think when Eagle River was annexed many, many decades ago, they declined to participate. I don't know the history of it.
And the impact of that is that after the 2018 earthquake, all those houses that were damaged significantly in the Eagle River was because they were not part of the service area. Therefore, they did fall under the same code that the rest of the city falls under.
That's what I was getting at too, is that how it ties into building codes, if anybody knows anything about that, because building codes are
It
different.
drives the like the developer, the codes the developer present.
And the third is that grants all receive IGCs, and those IGCs should be charged out to grants according to the terms of the grants. So IGCs come into this plot of the pools together costs, and then the cost should be allocated to the grants. But when you fail to allocate those costs out properly and timely, you build this liability that at one point has to be written off. And as it turns out, a little bit of a liability has built up that at one point in time will have to be written off. And it's about $2 million right now. So that will have to be dealt with fairly soon. Then there's a real estate loan that was unfortunately lent from the workers' comp fund that we just talked about over to the real estate department. So the real estate department could acquire a piece of property right by the Lusek Library that we call the archives property. And I think it has a balance of about $5 million. And now we're on the cusp of trying to either sell and or develop that property. Unfortunately, we just very recently obtained the appraisal for that same property. And as it turns out, it now appears that the property is underwater relative to that inter-fund loan. The mistake that was made years ago was when the inter-fund loan was created, it only required interest payments to be made rather than requiring that the loan amortize down. And that loan is very old now. If the loan had been required to amortize down, we'd have no problem. So at some point in time, I predict that there will be a write-off required. And right now it's underwater maybe by about $1 million, $1.3 million. Next is the municipal light power closeout. Municipal light power was sold in the year 2000. So an accounting transaction should have occurred in year 2000 or 2020 or the year 2021, but no accounting entry was made. Maybe 2022, but no accounting entry was made. It is absolutely mandatory that an entry be made in 2023. We have discovered that some accounting, some spending has occurred that shouldn't have occurred that relates to funds that were received from the sale of NLMP that will need to be replenished. And a funding source needs to be identified. During the Q1 budget, we did identify and propose in the Q1 budget a funding source, but it was the Q1 budget was amended. And so that funding source was used for different purposes. It has to be replaced, and that's about $800,000. Then the last item is the biggest item, and I think this will be new to all of you because I don't think we've talked about this one before, and that is the IT department. IT provides services to all the other departments and should charge to cover its costs. There are two problems with IT. Number one is when SAP, we all know SAP ended up costing far more than its budget. And so when SAP was finally placed in service, a decision was made that instead of charging out SAP over the same life as it was being depreciated, they decided that that would be too expensive for the recipients of those costs. So a decision was made that they would charge out the cost of SAP over a longer life. And so because the depreciation, the expense is being charged over 10 years, but the recovery of the costs is being recovered over 15 years, there's a gap between the two. And IT has grown on its balance sheet a deficit. And the deficit at the end of 2022 was $34 million. There's a different issue with IT as well, and that's due to. So IT owes general government cash, and that conceptually represents the fact that IT spends money to invest in capital expenditure, and then when the number gets big, they borrow money on the third-party market, and then they replenish it. So conceptually, every now and then that number should become zero when they borrow that money. But we've discovered recently that it's not working like it should be, and it never gets to zero. We have not yet figured out where the gap is. I have tentatively concluded that we may have a serious problem, but I have not yet entirely concluded that. Right now, the due to at the end of 2022 is $27 million. It should be about $12 million. So it's the 15 million that I'm worried about. And so two parts. Number one, I'm worried about the $15 million. Why is it bigger than it should be? But also the auditors came in and they said, hold on a second. IT is showing that it owes general government $27 million, but it showed as a current liability, meaning that it's going to pay $27 million to general government in the year 2023. Okay, well, we all know 2023 has come and gone, right? And did IT pay general government $27 million? So I can answer that question. They didn't. So, and they're not going to pay it in 2024 either. Because remember that when they implemented SAP, they decided that SAP wouldn't be recovered for 15 years. So the auditors in 2022 made a decision, and they said you have to move that $27 million receivable from IT from current to long-term. So that had a very serious and negative impact to the municipality of Anchorage. Right now, we had it as part of our fund balance. right? We're gonna have got this receivable. And when the auditor said it's not really a receivable that you're gonna collect anytime soon, that created in 2022, it widened the gap in our fund balance, and it created an unexpected problem that we didn't expect to have. So that's the news that I'm sharing with you now. Is our deficit that we already knew we had is going to be $27 million higher than we thought.
So that's probably a reason that we haven't had audit reports for the last couple, 3 years.
No, you had a 2021 audit report, and that's not the reason why this audit report is slow. And that's our next topic.
Just to acknowledge, Member Cloud showed up at about 12 p.m. Any questions on this topic?
Okay.
Real quick, and this will be touched on, I think, in the next topic, the ACR update. But you're not adjusting the past financial statements, right? Are these showing up as opinions or qualified opinions on the audited financials?
So no, we still expect to get in what's called an unqualified audit opinion, I believe. So that won't be the impact. The impact will be that our fund balance deficit will be higher than we had expected, and we will not, to answer your question, change 2021. There will be a 2022 erosion of our health.
The expectation, though, is that it would be an unqualified.
No, it will be an unqualified, which is it will be a good auditor's opinion, I think, still.
So it could have an effect on our bond rating.
No, yes, that is possible, yes.
And we'll move on to 6B. Also just, the agenda was amended, so this is going to be the annual comprehensive report update. So an update on the audits. And the
Okay.
status.
And so the ACFR update is that we still have not issued the 2022 financial statements. Last week, solid waste for 2022 was issued. Everything has to be done sequentially. So the ACFR can't be issued until the port's issued, water is issued, wastewater is issued, solid waste is issued, and ACDA is issued, the PAC is issued. And so the fact that solid waste was issued was extremely helpful, but we're still working on grants. And the auditors decided that they needed to do grant testing. And so they're still testing grants, but we're getting much closer. And the remaining items are that $27 million we just talked about has to be moved. And that's item number one. Item number two is that we have the letters to all the attorneys that we're working with outside of the municipality have to go out. Aaron's gonna help type those letters today. The current mayor will come in today and sign those letters. And then legal on the 7th floor needs to prepare a summary of all open litigation for BDO next week. And then the concurring review partner at BDO will need to review the financials. That will take at least 2 weeks. So we expect the 2022 ACFR will be issued in approximately 2 weeks' time.
Any questions?
And then we will immediately start on 2023, except I won't be here, so.
You mentioned that the $27 million deficit again. I think again, though, is that going to be an opinion, or is that going to be? Is there adjustments to financial statements?
We need to do a reclassification on the balance sheet. So it's not an opinion. It's a change of where a number is recorded.
And so maybe just a high level overview of why, obviously, just in your opinion, the audited financials, so the ACFR is at this point delayed to this level?
Okay, so I think there's about 10 drivers. One driver is that about a year ago, almost all of the controller division staff voluntarily resigned. The assistant controller resigned and she obtained employment elsewhere. And then there were a lot of openings where she worked. And so she recruited a bunch of her staff, her prior staff, to come join her. And so we lost 7 employees essentially at the same time. So then we hired a new controller, a new assistant controller. They came in and they didn't know how to perform any functions. And there was no ability to cross-train because everyone was brand new. And that was a huge setback. And we had a brand new CFO. And then, of course, I was brand new. So no one knew how to do anything. That's puts you in essentially an impossible situation. So we had essentially 100% turnover. That's reason number one. And reason number two is, and I can say this because I was sort of asked to come in and help. When I was asked to come in and help, I saw firsthand why we had some of the challenges we had. All of our financial statements, water, wastewater, port, refuse, disposal, ACDA, and the PAC, they all have 12/31 year end. What that means is they all have to be issued before the ACFR can be issued. And that's, in retrospect, a mistake. I just submitted my transition report to the incoming mayor, and I recommended that all of those other financial reports have a September 30th year end. And then the ACFR can have a 12/31 year end. Because I received the first set of review notes from BDO, there were over 3,000 review notes. And a lot of them, 500 or more, said things like this. On the water utility financial statements, this number ends with a 6. Over here on the ACFR, the number ends with a 7. They have to match perfectly. So spent 100 hours getting those numbers to match perfectly. And that's really, we're how many billions of that? We have $7 billion of assets, right? So number one, we don't have enough resources to issue all of these financials at the same time. There's no value in doing so. And number two, to have all of these numbers match perfectly is not a good use of anyone's time. So we bifurcate them, then that huge issue goes away and the workload gets spread out. So that's issue number two. Issue number three is what I learned is that we have a whole system of, if you think about a pyramid, right? In a pyramid, the brick on the bottom touches the brick that's on top of it, which touches the brick on top of it, and everything supports everything underneath it. Well, when you set up a framework that feeds into financial statements, the financial statement over here feeds into this financial statement, and it feeds into this financial statement, and so on and so on. So it's like a pyramid. And the balance sheet on top, which is Exhibit A1, if I make a change down here, it should automatically feed up. And they should always agree perfectly, because if I change something here, it should just immediately flow. But that's not what we have right now, because whatever was prepared years ago, everything is independent. So we have a little schedule over here that, pulls in from the system. We have a schedule over here that pulls in from the system. And the problem is you're rounding to pull in things from the system that are in pennies, and you have to round them from dollars. So you're $1 off in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of places. That's problem number three. So everything has to be redone in a logical fashion that links. Problem number four is when you have a set of reports that's 300 pages long, every single report has, does the balance sheet balance, does everything roll, does everything tie, has its own set of little balancers that you can't see. But the problem is you have to review every page over and over and over again. You should have one single tab in Excel that collects all of those questions in a single place, so you can review it once a day and make sure all of your items are in perfect balance. No one has enough knowledge here at the city to know how valuable setting that up is. No one's ever done that. So that's problem number four. Problem number 5 is, I should probably stop. I could keep on.
Yeah, maybe we could take a pause and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, I could go on for.
Member Slaughter?
Yeah, one question I have with the ACFR, you mentioned like if it was released on 12/31 instead of 9/30, that would be easier to deal with. But isn't part of the reason why they want it earlier, they being like the administration and assembly, is because of the budget, the next year's budget, doesn't it? Don't they?
So to be clear, the ACFR would continue to be issued on 12/31.
Okay,
It's all the other financial statements. that
on
are-
9/30 or on 12/31?
So the ACFR would continue to be issued,
Calendar.
no change.
Yeah.
12/31. All the other financial statements are a major source of this problem because everything is sequential. I couldn't wrap up the ACFR until I got the solid waste numbers. They were only issued last week, right? Or the municipal airport. I only got those numbers 10 days ago. And so it's like holding the ACFR hostage when you have so many components that you're waiting on. We need to stop that and stop waiting on all these other audits. And stop waiting on ticking and tying hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other independent audits. Because it just creates a monster that we can't feed. It's really imperative that we make this change.
So it's sounded like it's a gross mess.
It's a gross mess.
Okay.
I mean, are we seeing it as like an inputs accounting as we go issue, or it sounds like we're trying to clean up a lot of things that were supposedly standard operations that ended up not being standard operations, and then we have to go back and it becomes a lot heavier on the audit and response side.
So it is expensive to hire a team of people of the caliber that you need to issue an ACFR of the complexity of the municipality. You would need 6 or 7 people who were really, really high-level CPAs. The municipality has no interest in funding that kind of team of people. That's part of your problem. So you need to look for other solutions. If there's no interest in budgeting and paying for that kind of team, then you need to look for other solutions. And one solution is, okay, get these other financials at September 30th so you can reduce the workload and spread the workload.
But would that team be purely about internal audits and response with BDO as the external auditor, or
So we don't
have accounting team?
But we have an accounting team. We have an accounting team that's probably half of what it needs to be. And there is not an interest or an ability to fully staff it to where it needs to be, to keep the financial statement demands and timing at what they're currently scheduled at, which is everything is delivered at the same time every year. So.
I think I have 12:35 as the time to move to the next agenda item. Do we have any more, or do we want to move on to the next agenda item? All right, if we could move to 6C, Eagle Exit.
Okay,
I got one quick question. Have you written these down for the recommendations?
so,
Number one.
so I've already submitted my transition plan to the incoming mayor, and it has 10 items, and one of them is the change in fiscal year end for the enterprise funds and utilities.
It'd be nice to see a copy of that.
But it's public, I'm sure it's public.
Maybe. Yeah, I think it would be up to you if you wanted to show. I'm sure we could.
I'm happy to share. It's certainly not anything, and quite frankly, some of the other things we just talked about, like workers' comp and general liability, are on it as well. So.
Okay, moving on to the next agenda item, Eagle Exit.
So forgive me for going fast, but I have a PowerPoint and there's a lot on it because this is a big topic. And so we'll have to go full screen.
I'm just sharing it right now.
Okay. And so as a way of background, for those of you who are unaware, the community of Eagle River and Judiac, some members of the community are interested in pursuing cessation from the municipality of Anchorage. And so this topic is about some of the legal and accounting issues. Can I use the keyboard instead? Is that possible? Some of the legal and accounting issues related to that cessation. So next is, this is a disclaimer because what I've done today is I pulled numbers from the draft 2022 ACFR. And as we know, we still have at least one entry, a big one, that needs to run through the ACFR. So just don't take any of these numbers as final numbers. Okay, so 6 topics, including a review of state of Alaska law, a couple of lower 48 examples, what are the concepts that we're dealing with, a few numbers, some challenges and opportunities. So let's start off with state of Alaska law. So state of Alaska law includes an opportunity for detachment, and detachment requires that the entity that is interested in detachment include a practical plan demonstrating what it intends to do. And this is another excerpt of code, but we're going to skip this because this is the same slide with some interesting provisions highlighted. And the reason why I highlighted some of the words is that state law does not allow a detachment if the impact of a detachment results in a reduction in bond rating. So if Eagle exit, if the separation of one municipality into a municipality and a borough resulted in a reduced bond rating, then it would not end up being approved by the state of Alaska. Here's another state code citation, which references the state local boundary commission and what its requirements are. And primarily look at the first citation, which is citation A. And its highest requirement is that it reviews the request and determines if the request is, quote, in the best interests of the state, which is very intriguing to me. If the local boundary commission approves the request, the next step is that the request goes to the state legislature for approval. The request also, interestingly, goes in front of the residents, but only the residents in the actual area that's going to be detached. So what that means is I, as a Hillsider, would not vote on this, which is kind of interesting. State of Alaska approval is not guaranteed or assured. So recently in May of 2024, Hoonah requested to form, I don't know how to pronounce that word, a borough. And what they had proposed was dissolving the city of Hoonah and incorporating a non-unified home rule borough into this new borough. But the local boundary commission denied their request. And their reasons for denial including, number one, they were merely trading one local government that existed today for another local government tomorrow. This new local government that was being proposed did not assume any new responsibilities for services that were currently being delivered by the state of Alaska. So in other words, remember that one requirement, does the state benefit? In this case, the state didn't benefit from borough formation. And the commission objected because this borough that they were forming was very tiny. It had about 900 citizens, and it expressly excluded communities that were nearby, such as Pelican, and there was no proposal to consolidate school districts. There's also some reference to taxation, and this is a citation for the application process. So topic number one summary is that detachment is possible. The decision makers are the voters within the affected area, the local boundary commission, and the state of Alaska legislature. Interestingly, there are some lower 48 examples, and I have a question for everybody. Can anyone guess what the largest detachment in the history of the United States is? Yes.
West Virginia.
That's right, West
Civil
Virginia.
War.
And so the history behind West Virginia is when the Civil War was started, Virginia said, we're enjoying the war, we're going to fight the Northerners. And West Virginia said, wait a second, we're not farmers, we don't have slaves, we're not interested in fighting this war. And by the way, we've been paying a lot of taxes to Virginia. We have not been getting services in exchange. And so that was the formation of West Virginia. And after the end of the Civil War, they were not at all interested in going back and reforming with Virginia. So that is why West Virginia continues to exist today. But there are also more modern examples. So Staten Island, which is part of New York City, joined New York City in 1897. And initially, services improved as they had promised until 1948. A landfill called Fresh Kills was formed against the vociferous objections of local residents. And it displaced beautiful tidal wetlands, marshes, and freshwater wetlands, and became the largest dump in the entire planet Earth, 2,200 acres, and received 29,000 tons of waste per day. And Staten Island used to have representation on the New York City board, 1 out of 5 votes. But later, a Supreme Court ruling in 1989 reduced their representation to only 3 out of 51 members on the city council. So their 20% voice was reduced to 6%. But when Rudy Giuliani became mayor, one of his platforms was, I'm going to make you happy again. He promised to close Fresh Kills and make the Staten Island ferry free. And that was part of why he was elected. And Fresh Kills was closed in the year 2001. But now cessation efforts are back underway for different reasons. And here's a picture of the landfill today. It has been closed and it's in the process of being restored. It still has more restoration efforts to go. Now here's San Fernando Valley in California. San Fernando Valley has continuously attempted to secede from San Bernardino County ever since the 1920s, and it has yet to succeed. The complaints are high taxes compared to services. The county is too large for representation, etc. But the efforts have consistently failed, essentially due to lack of required votes. And there are constant complaints and accusations of white power and white flight. Then in the lower 48, more recently, Baton Rouge was recently approved for cessation from, excuse me, St. George has recently been approved to secede from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And initially, all they wanted was a separate school district. That failed, so they said, okay, we want more now. We want complete separation from you, and they have achieved that. But a failed effort was Buckhead's attempt to secede from Atlanta, Georgia. That failed because of fears of the GO bond obligation, which is an area-wide obligation of all of the full faith of the entire city of Atlanta. And again, accusations of white flight. And interestingly, Buckhead residents comprise 20% of Atlanta's population, but provide 40% of its tax revenue. So topic number 2 summary is annexations, where cities grow and take on rural areas, are far more common than cessations. Successful cessations are very rare. The likelihood of cessation succeeding depends upon what the rules are and the steps. If the majority of all voters, including the voters outside of the area that wants to secede, have to approve, such as San Fernando Valley have to approve, you're out of luck, really. Or only the voters living within the area, such as Alaska. So in Alaska, the chance of cessation goes way up. You always have to demonstrate justification and be prepared to be accused of white flight. Number 3, let's talk about it.
Real briefly,
Sure.
just want to check, see if anybody has any questions so far.
Yeah, one quick one. So the state legislature would also have to approve.
Yes.
That's a full
So
vote of the, okay.
voters approve within the area. Local boundary commission approves if it decides that it's in the state's best interest, and then the state legislature approves.
Is that an approval by the local boundary commission or a recommendation?
They approve it.
Okay, so if they don't approve, it doesn't even go to the legislature.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's talk about Eagle Exit in particular as it relates to the MOA. And let's start off with a theoretical story. So this is a lot like a divorce. So imagine a blended second family where a husband and wife marry, but each bring kids and assets and debts into the marriage. And then they have a couple of additional children together as husband and wife. And the second marriage had a prenup, but they added assets, wealth, and new liabilities in the second marriage. And then they decide to divorce. But for the sake of the children, they decide that one of them is going to hold on to the house so that the children have less disruption. But the house is heavily mortgaged and it's underwater. And they also own a boat, cars, a timeshare, and everything is leveraged. And they have retirement accounts, and one of the spouses has a pension, and the other spouse has a 401k account. And then they have one dog, and they both want the dog. So it could get crazy complicated. So how do they divide up all these leveraged assets when one spouse has a great credit rating and the other spouse maybe has had a bankruptcy in his or her past and has no credit rating? How do you deal with the house? And then who gets the dog, right? And that's what we're dealing with, right? So the first concept is, would Eagle Exit receive, I'm using a 20% number as just my guess of what the population is. I haven't actually done the math yet to determine what their population is. But would they receive 20% of $8.9 billion? Because that's the assets of the municipality at the end of 2022. That's the best number I have right now. And that's the number, if you could actually see this slide, that's the number of the assets. And the answer is no. So just like the family we talked about, the municipality has billions of dollars of debt. And so we really don't want to focus on assets. We need to get to a different number. Okay, so would they receive maybe 20% of $4.6 billion? So $4.6 billion is what the number is. Let me see, I've got to put my glasses on. That's the slide 24. $4.6 billion is the municipality's total net position. But the problem is that net position has components that don't really represent equity. So let's take a look at those components. So here are the components of net position. And if we look at the first one, that's kind of a strange thing to think of as equity. So essentially, that's capital assets. So years ago, we were implementing a gas fee when I happened to be the CFO. And the gas fee rule was roads. And government accounting standards were changing, and we were at a T in the road. And they said, we're going to have to start accounting for our roads and infrastructure better. And you made a choice. And we made the very unusual choice of capitalizing our roads, which meant that every 5 years or so, and I'm not making this up, this is really true, somebody goes out with a machine that measures the thickness of the roads. And there's a footnote in that, in the advert, you read this. And we have to actually prove that we're not allowing our roads to become dilapidated. And so that number that you see right there is primarily comprised of roads as well as other capital assets. So it's not really cash. It's not really investments. It's really, we made an accounting decision a long time ago that, and it was really a promise, not just roads, but a promise that we were going to not only record our roads, but that we were going to always maintain them. And so we're going to have to get to a lower level before we can decide what the divorce would look like. But notice that I've highlighted two of the numbers in particular, because there's two numbers that I think really are worth talking about if I was the divorce attorney. And those are the Convention Center Operating Reserve, which means the Civic Center, and the other is the MOA Trust Fund. So let's talk about those, because I think those are fair game. And we will talk about both of those in another slide. And then we've got some more concepts. Proprietary funds, which are enterprise funds like a port and utilities, component units, which and also non-major government funds and internal service funds, LRSAs, Subversas, and Anchorage roads, other divergent service areas like police and parks and rec and fire, and then area-wide assets. And some are located within Eagle River Chugach, some are located outside. So let's talk about my favorite, which is enterprise funds and utilities. And that's the list right there. You've got water, wastewater, port, solid waste, airport, and hydro. Okay, so here in the bottom right-hand corner is the, what I would call equity, because I'm old-fashioned, but in government, you have to call it net position. So 192 million in net position at the end of 2022. So at first glance, one of the spouses says, I get half of that. Or in Eagle River's case, they might say, I get 20% of that. So at first glance, it seems as if that would be a shareable number. But the reality is that the vast majority of that number is comprised from one tiny little enterprise fund, and that's the airport. And so you can see that right there. There's the municipal airport. And almost all of it or half of it comes just from Merrill Field. And so you think, well, okay, I'll take 20% of that, please. But here's the interesting story about the airport. The airport's funding comes from one source, and that is the Federal Department of Transportation through grants. And the Department of Transportation doesn't just give away money with no strings attached. Yeah, and so it says, every time it gives you money, it says, oh, by the way, here, sign this document. And yeah, and so none of that money is available, and that net position is not associated, if you look up on the assets, with a whole bunch of cash. So essentially, it's all restricted, it's all hands off. But what about the other utilities? The other enterprise funds and utilities have much less equity, and it's all really required to stay with them because they have to maintain their bond ratings, they have to be able to issue new debt, and they have to be able to comply with their debt covenants, right? But what other options do we have to be fair? And so what other options exist? And so option one is a more Hatfield versus McCoy option, which is, well, divide the physical assets, you know, sort of a King Solomon option. Divide the physical assets based on where the property is located, which gets super interesting because where is the hydro plant located, right? And where is the landfill located? And where is Okludna Lake located? It's pretty interesting pretty fast. But I think we should stop, because what would the state say when they go in front of that commission and the commission decides, is this in the state's best interest to consider option one? I have a feeling I know what the answer would be, right? And then the RCA, how would the RCA look at that if an attempt was made to take one utility, Anchorage Water and Wastewater Utility, which technically is two, and to break it up and to form two utilities with two CFOs and two presidents and two, rate cases and tariffs and everything. I don't think that would get very far. So I think an option two, which is, what's really the objective, which is a fair allocation of resources. And as budget director, I can tell you that owning an asset like HWW with $1 billion of assets really doesn't get you much except for MUSA, or MISA in the case of the port, and dividends, right? So that's really what your objective would be, which is to share that cash flow stream. And so one possibility would be to come to an agreement with your spouse that you share the dog. You get the dog 1 week, your spouse gets the dog the next week, right? And this is a concept where you pool all MISA and MISA, because conceptually post-divorce, the new borough would be collecting MISA and MISA for the assets located in its geographic territory, right? So this municipality would want some of that MISA and MISA and vice versa. So you'd want to agree to create a pool and then reallocate that pool of those assets post-divorce. And so this is kind of conceptually how that could be considered. Next are the component units, which are civic, aka the Denina Center. That's a blended component unit. And a blended component unit is a legally separate organization so closely related to the primary government that it's essentially the same. And then component units are school district, ACDA, and the PAC. And a component unit is a legally separate organization that is financially accountable to the primary government.
Real quick, Sharon, just time check. We only have about 5 more minutes, and checking, see if anybody has any questions so far.
Well, we're not going to get done then. I think, well, that's okay. I'll just talk for 5 more minutes then.
It's up to you. We just,
Yeah.
however we want to
Okay.
do it. But just to, yeah, you go
Okay.
ahead.
Okay, so Civic owns Denina, but it also owns Egan. And it issued $94 million in revenue bonds to construct Denina. And they're backed by the revenues of Egan and Denina. The bonds are very complex. And they have a debt service fund and a debt service reserve fund. When the bonds are fully repaid in 2038, title to Civic transfers to the municipality. Here is an excerpt of the operating reserve fund and the revenue bond fund. And interestingly, what Eagle Exit might consider would be to negotiate a portion of future excess waterfalls. And Assemblymember Brawley just touched on that maybe half an hour ago, because we are on the cusp of starting to receive some annual revenues from Denina beginning in approximately a year from now. But also look at that operating reserve fund. When 2038 happens and the bond is fully repaid, whatever's left in that fund reverts back to the municipality. And so Eagle Exit will want to be careful to know that now and say when that happens, at that time, 20% of that will be transferred to us. Other components, units, school district, Eagle Exit will need to negotiate directly with the school district. ACDA pays MISA to the municipality $700,000 in 2022, but no dividend. So Eagle Exit would consider negotiating a share of MISA, just like that chart we looked at. And the PAC does not pay a dividend to the municipality and likely never will. So in governmental funds, we've got the 5 majors, and we've also got non-major funds. And non-major funds account for assets held by the city as an agent. And they include special revenue funds, debt service funds, capital projects funds, and the permanent fund. And there are a lot of them, but the 2 that Eagle Exit could be interested in particular are Heritage Land Bank and the Opioid Settlement Fund. And so Eagle Exit could consider negotiating a share of the Opioid Settlement Fund and Heritage Land Bank assets. Debt service funds are the 3 shown here. The Civic Ventures Revenue Bond Fund is the one that it should focus on if it were interested in my advice. Capital projects funds are shown here. And Eagle Exit would want to scrub each fund to research its nature. the funding source and any restrictions to see if there were opportunities to pursue a claim on the assets. The permanent fund relates to the cemetery and there's not much there. Internal service funds account for the financing of goods or services by one department or agency to others. So we've talked about IT at great length, but there's 4 others. Here is the balance sheet, and it's too small to see, but the summary is that Eagle Exit could consider negotiating a portion of total waste management's net position, which is $20 million at the end of 2022, and a share of fleet assets. Those are all the autos. And as we just discussed, IT has a huge deficit, which, to be fair, Eagle Exit would receive an allocation of that cost, just like MLMP received an allocation of the SAP cost when MLMP was sold.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to, just so we can get through the rest of the agenda real quick, cut you off. And if you could send this to, or if it's up on the BAC website, send this to everybody.
Okay.
But moving on to the BAC member discussion, specifically, I know we didn't get to finish this, but is this a future topic people want to go into, or do we want to discuss some other topics? Specifically for the next meeting, I think is priority 1. And as saying before, we'll have emails going out that just email myself or Aaron with any topics that are proposed for future meetings as well. But maybe for next meeting, any ideas of the commission? Any input on following up on the Eagle Exit discussion, or we had discussion about alcohol and marijuana tax as a future meeting, or sales tax discussion.
Yeah, I would throw out there the Project Anchorage proposal, the 3% sales tax. That could be something this group may want to discuss. I did the estimate for revenues for it. I think alcohol and marijuana are ones that are interesting, because there's going to be the change with the marijuana funds for early childhood. I think that could be an interesting topic. Eagle Exit is also super fascinating, and I don't think we've fully grasped it all yet.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there. Specifically, we were getting a little bit into the weeds, but I think even just at a high level, there's physical assets and there's capital assets, and then so it's with regards to pooling and splitting cash flows. There needs to be, that's kind of the income statement side of things, but then the balance sheet, how that's proposed to be split out. If there's any timelines or proposed schedules for developing a proposal coming from Eagle Exit to the administration, the future steps sort of thing. But even just starting at a high level is kind of where I think I'm still a little lost as to if we're dealing with things on a property tax assessed value share, or on a population share of things, or per capita services versus just kind of at a very high level. I think I was missing some of the asset splits and the cash flow splits. I'd be open to maybe 15 minutes at the next meeting just to close out the slideshow. But we're just real briefly, is everybody okay with going an extra 5 minutes to 1:05 p.m. today? Sure. Any objection to that? Okay, so we got about 4 minutes to wrap up BAC member discussion. Through email, we might send out what the next meeting agenda is going to be, what the main topic for the next meeting is, if everybody's okay with that. And if there's no more, moving on to audience participation, I see we have a few, Michael Tavalero, Nanny P. If you guys have anything to add with regards to audience participation.
I'm good, thank you.
Well, thank you for calling in. I appreciate it. Sorry we didn't get to you until right at the end here. Open discussion. Anything else to bring up today? So the next scheduled meeting, July 11th, I'll discuss with ASD about their availability. It sounds like they should be available. Their update might be a little light, but we can talk about the stuff that they're working on. Yeah, those sorts of things, the right sizing plan. And I'll follow up with by email with other things. When I send out the agenda, I'll also request any questions regarding the main meeting topic, just so we can maybe prep slideshows, streamline them a little bit. Otherwise, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved. Oh, sorry.
Oh, you go ahead.
Okay, so moved.
Second.
Hearing no objection, the BAC is adjourned. Thank you.
So your last day, Sharon, is,
So I think it'll be July 1.